טוב, בוקר טוב, תודה לכולם שבאו. אני אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. Good morning, I'm going to do the presentation in English. What I'm going to try to do is set a little bit of the stage of what are we talking about when we talk about the Israeli military industries, because we'll talk about a lot of different aspects today of these industries and how they affect people around the world, but would like to do kind of a more general overview of what we're actually talking about. Because what we're talking about is a huge part of Israeli income, of the Israeli industries in general. Before we go into the income and why this export is so profitable, I'd like to just take a second to also talk about the expenditure, the military expenditure in Israel, just to set that at first. So if you look at the charts above me, Israel today is the fourth biggest spender of arms in percentage of the GDP, in percentage of the economy of the country. So you can see the list. There's Saudi Arabia, South Sudan, Oman, and then Israel. And if you're wondering, the world average is spending about 2% of a country's GDP on military expenses, and Israel is about 3 times more than that. Okay, we're talking about around 6%. So we're talking about a huge expense of the state. This expense is mostly public expense. This will be relevant information when we talk about the income, which is mostly private income. It also means that the biggest budget within the government is the budget of the Ministry of Defense, so the military budget. And there's a lot of other budgets that are not there but are about defense, things like, or not about defense, but about military expenses, things like the prison system. As we know, there are thousands of Palestinian prisoners in the prison system within Israel. That's not even reflected when we talk about the military budget, although it should be. The Mossad, the Shabak, there's a lot of other places where even more money is hiding. So we're talking about a very big chunk of Israeli expenses. And when we think about these things from an economic perspective, we have to kind of ask ourselves, what is the economic benefit? Why is Israel willing to spend so much money on this whole military and occupation? And part of that, and again I'm saying it's just part of the answer, we'll also be talking about what is the other side of that, which is the income that comes from that industry. Did I press the wrong thing? I did. So when we're talking about the income, and this is where things start to be very interesting. So Israel today, and this chart is not updated. It said that Israel is the 10th biggest exporter of arms. Israel today is the 6th biggest exporter of arms in absolute numbers. If you try to calculate that either per capita or per GDP, per the economy, Israel is the #1 exporter of arms in the world. If we talk about, for instance, drones, then up until last year, Israel was the #1 drone exporter in the world in absolute numbers. This year, China just passed Israel, but just to kind of understand the kind of economies we're talking about, the 3 leading exporters of drones in the world that kind of switch positions around who is the biggest one are the US, China, and Israel. Obviously, Israel is not even close to the same size of economy. So we're talking about a huge industry, that one of the main things that we need to ask ourselves is how is it so successful? I mean, the fact that Israel exports arms means that other countries buy these arms. And we need to ask ourselves, why are they buying these arms and not others? If we look a little bit about some of the numbers of the export, you can see that the export is increasing constantly. So these are figures of some of the big companies in Israel that export arms, and you can see that every year, and more specifically after every big military operation, if you remember these years, these exports go up and up. And the military industry itself makes the connection between their ability to sell and military operations. So there's a quote above me of a marketer of one of the big military industries in the country that said, a scenario in which there won't be a big military operation for 20 years will severely harm the arms industries. What they're actually saying by this is very clearly, we need military operations, we need the ability to show what our weapons do in order to sell them. And this is kind of a lot of what the Israeli military industry is based on. It's based on the ability to develop, test, and then also showcase and actually use different military systems, which many countries can't do because they don't have ongoing conflict in which they can constantly do this. And the occupation allows Israel an opportunity to constantly do this. And what that looks like is, for instance, if you look at the left, this is a list of military systems that had their first operational debut during the attack on Gaza in 2014. So while 2,400 people were killed in Gaza, all of these systems were tried for the first time actually in battle. And then later on, less than a month after this attack ended, there was already an expo of drones near Ben Gurion Airport selling a lot of these same systems. If you look to the right, what you'll see is a poster. This is a poster for a Hermes 450 fighter jet. It's a fighter drone. It's an Elbit system drone. Among other things, one of the drones that was used for bombings in Gaza in 2014. And if you look at the right corner on the top, there's a yellow stamp. You can't read it very well, but what that stamp says is battle proven. Okay, this is how you market weapons. The ability of a company to say we actually tested our weapons in battle means that the worth of the product goes up. And so when we're talking about the Israeli companies, obviously they have a head start on that, right? Because they can constantly check these weapons and use them. But it's important to say this is not only an issue of Israeli companies. It means that other companies from around the world have a vested interest in selling Israel arms and having the Israeli military use their weapons so they can later on say our weapons are battle-proven and are not only battle-proven, but battle-proven specifically by the Israeli military. And this is a very important point because the Israeli military has managed to kind of label itself or market itself as one of the best militaries in the world. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know how these things are measured, but this is the general kind of consensus. What that means is that when other militaries are looking at what kind of weaponry are we going to buy, then the fact that a company can say Israel chose to use our weapons adds value to that weapon. It's part of the Israel label that is part of the military industry. So this is another kind of very important thing, which is again true not only for Israeli companies, but also for international ones. So you have probably the most absurd case of this is the case of the US fighter jet, the F-35. This is a huge project. It's a $1.5 trillion project that is literally too big to fail. The only problem with this project is that it's a very bad plane from a military perspective. The first editions had like 360-something malfunctions. We're talking about a really bad plane. Obviously, that means that they can't sell it. Nobody wants to buy it. So what do? So the US comes to Israel and says, please take some of these planes from us and use them. And we're not going to even sell them to you. We're going to give them to you as part of the military aid that the US gives Israel annually, right? The US gives $3.8 billion annually to Israel in military aid. So we're not even asking you to pay for these, just take them and use them. And Israel in response said, no thanks. It's a terrible plane, and we have absolutely no interest in it. We'd rather use the military aid for other things. And the US actually really stood their grounds. And they went back and forth for a bit until the US actually threatened Israel in what is probably the strongest threat, at least in the last 30 years, from US administrations. And I'm willing to bet that most people in this room haven't heard about it. What the US said is that there's an agreement between the US and Israel, part of a military agreement, that says that the US will not sell the same level of weapons to other Middle Eastern countries. Okay, the idea is that Israel always has the best level and everyone else can only buy from the US one level down. Among other things, it means that the US really wants to make sure that Israel always has the newest technology because then they can sell everyone else one step up. Right? So there's like this aspect of the arms trade that's even bigger. But specifically that is part of the agreement. The US threatened Israel that if they don't take these planes that they don't want, then they will break that agreement. And yet no one in this room heard about that. That's a huge threat. Israel agreed eventually. We bought, I think, 19 of them. The first one just arrived a few months ago. We don't even know if they'll ever be operational, but the moment that that sale was announced, that became public, the stocks of the big American company that is producing this plane, Lockheed Martin, went up, right? And the sales of this plane worldwide went up because the Israeli military bought it. That must be good. That must mean something. So there's a whole label around that again is based on maintaining the occupation. Without an occupation, you don't have that label. You can't talk about constant military operations where you can test these weapons, where you can prove that they work. And it's important to say we're not only talking about weapons, we're also talking about training, we're talking about a huge variety of things. And that means that anywhere you go today in the world, you will find Israeli military systems. And we'll hear a lot of that throughout the day. Just a couple of examples here. On your left, you'll see the wall in Arizona between the US and Mexico. We'll hear more about that later today, but that is Israeli technology doing the surveillance around that. On the right, you'll see an Israeli military vehicle in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. Again, something that we will hear more about later. So there's this sale of equipment, both technology and weapons. And then there's also the question of training. When you sell a weapon or when you train a foreign military or police, it's not just the weapon itself that you're selling, but it's the ideology that comes with it. So for instance, if you sell someone tear gas for protests, the ideology that comes with it is protests need to be dispersed. You don't say that, but that's kind of the underlying idea, right? The same goes for training. If police departments from around the world come to Israel to train with Israeli border police, what Israeli border police knows to do best is to control a civilian enemy population. That's how they see their own mission. You bring a police force to come and train with them, you're not just training them about the tactics of how do you go right or left, you're training them about that ideology. How do you control a civilian enemy population? And they go back to their countries, to their cities, and that's what they do. They control civilian enemy populations. It's the civilians of their countries, but that's what they learn how to do. So there's a few aspects of it that we hope that the rest of today will be able to give a glance and kind of examples of what that looks like on different levels. Thank you.